thank you for tuning in for my talk today, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to start this talk on more of a broader topic about ethical human-robot interaction, with a noted question mark over there, by mentioning my nephew, actually. So my sister has an 18-month-old boy, and many months ago, she messaged me with a lot of emojis, and she asked, okay, guess what Ethan's second word is? And I guess something typical, like, you know, daddy or papa or something like that. And she told me that it's Google. And it took me a moment to realize how this could possibly be. And I remember that my sister has a Google Home at her place, and she uses it often. So I guess it shouldn't have been very surprising after the fact, because, you know, physical environment actually affects us, and the baby hears the word Google often. But I was actually surprised nonetheless, because it actually made me think about the first liner sentences I typically use when I write grants or publish papers. And it goes something along the lines of, technology is increasingly changing our lives every day, or technology influences our behaviors and decisions. And of course, I'm not telling you anything you don't know by saying tech changes our lives. And rarely do we ever make technologies to stay the same, right? But perhaps we can think about these statements from a more detailed lens. So in this talk, I'd like to delve deeper into the notion of technology and change. And in particular, I'd like to talk about the notion of interactive robots and how they influence people. As we strive to build robots that interact and communicate with people, we're essentially building systems that will influence people, not just in replacing us and our jobs, but in the way we behave, talk, and move. And in this way, what is the ethics of designing machines that influence people's behaviors and decisions? First of all, to get into the topic, we need to acknowledge the fact that we are, as social animals, we're hardwired to be influenced by our physical environment, and especially behaviors of the people around us. We habitually mimic postures of those we attend to. We match our tone of voice and pace of speech during a conversation. And you probably all have this experience when you're walking side by side with somebody, then you naturally synchronize the footsteps with the person you're walking next to. And scholars in psychology have been asserting that this kind of natural mimicry and influence of each other serves a social function, and that it's also good for us. It actually helps our interaction quality. It helps us to understand each other's mental states, improve empathy, have a positive perception of each other, and even lead to better cooperation between individuals. All that good stuff, right? And in human-robot interaction, we try to leverage this particular phenomenon. We found that robots can influence our motions and emotions by the way they move, for example. Just like how we synchronize our steps with each other, even with a robot arm, we find that we tend to fall in rhythm with the robot's movements. We call it entrainment or chameleon effect. And if the robot ever so minutely increase the speed, then we actually increase the speed of our motions accordingly as well. We also have studies that demonstrate how robots, just by being there, actually change the way we behave as well. So we call this social facilitation, which refers to that kind of change that occurs when there is somebody in the room versus not. For example, Reader et al. In 2012 put about 100 participants to a test where they put about 4 different tasks for the participants to do. And they had 3 different conditions: do these tasks alone, with a person in the room, versus with a robot in the room. And they found that compared to doing the same task alone, by mere presence of a social robot, they were able to sense a level of change in performance, as though there was a person in the room as well. And we are also finding that robots do change us by the numbers as well. There's a famous experiment called the ash line experiment, so-called conformity experiment, and that's a psychological experiment that demonstrated that, when you put a person in a room full of people and ask them very simple questions, and then take a look at that middle figure, for example. The task is essentially find the line on the right that matches the length of that on the left. Pretty easy. The answer is obviously C, and there is one right answer. In this ash line experiment, what they were able to find is if they had a number of confederates that say the wrong but the same wrong answer over and over again, then the participants would also conform to the wrong answer, following the norm of the people. So conformity. Now, in HRI, we were able to see an evidence of robots, a group of robots, being able to do the same. We're seeing that people do conform to robots to a certain degree, not to the same degree as in a group of people in such an obvious answered questions. But when we are engaged in a task that has a level of uncertainty involved. And at the same time, we also have studies where just by asking us to do certain things, we are able to get people to follow through with a robot's request. So, for example, in Salem et al.'s study back in 2015, we found that if you invite a participant over to a house-like environment and ask them to do some ridiculous things like dispose of these letters that clearly do not belong to you, then 90% of people would actually follow through with that task. And if you were to get the robot to ask person, please pour the orange juice from the bottle into the plant, a live plant, which we normally would not do, then they found that 68% of the people followed the task as well. So these are a very small snippet of some of the many examples and themes of the ways in which robots affect our behaviors and decisions. And you might ask, okay, so what? That's called HRI, right? If our designed robot interactions didn't lead to a change in people, then it wouldn't be interesting anyways. But there are some important differences we need to think about. So there are differences between influences that we have on each other and our natural environment influences us, versus how programmable machines that are designed to influence us actually do influence us. So unlike the human-human interaction cases, robots influence, or robots have the capacity to influence us rather, in ways that can be programmed, one-sided, and deployed at scale. So in human cases, when we think about a scalable influence, these are things like policy changes, right? So we elect a few, representatives in democratic societies, and then they make certain policy decisions, and think about the social distancing measures that are in effect across the world. It has tremendous changes in the way we've been working, doing groceries, and so on. And these are we accept these forms of influence because they come from these elected officials, and they're supposed to keep us safe, et cetera, and have a means of accountability. On the other hand, when we program things into robots, then and that in effect affects us, then these are kind of behavioral policy that's ingrained in by the designers, who are not necessarily elected officials. Depending on the gaze movement parameters that you put on the robot, for example, or the way the robot moves, we can really affect how the majority of the users of that robot will behave in response in a very predictive manner. So the question comes down to, okay, but we necessarily need to have some sort of predictive influence on people, just so that we can coordinate different tasks and actually get on with our lives in interacting with the robot and getting things done. But what machine-induced influences are socially acceptable? Because obviously there is a degree of moral spectrum you can explore in influence. What kind of robot influence is harmful to individuals or considered undesirable manipulation? Because not all forms of influence is morally questionable either. If we think about words like deception or coercion, I think you'll agree with me that they lie on the more negative side of the moral spectrum if you were to line them up in a single line of the good and the bad. So Pierre Hendelman wrote a book on manipulation, which offers a visual that you're seeing here, which maps the notion of manipulation across 3 axes. This manipulation in itself is a morally charged word, but he maps it along the axis of level of misleading, level of control, and level of influence. And that changes whether what we're talking about is persuasion, deception, or coercion. And manipulation can be thought of as planes that reside in the intersection between these extremes. And in many cases, the level of control we can exercise in instilling behavioral changes in people, such as entrainment and so on, I think is fairly high. And it's also I guess I'm getting a little bit meta here. It's a level of control that we can control through design. And there are a number of different issues we can think about seen from this particular lens, which is that when you think about changing people's behaviors predictably with a source of that influence being machines, we have this emotional feeling of yuck. There's a certain sense of discomfort there. And at the same time, apart from this emotional gut feeling, we also have a few different practical issues. If we understand the fact that many of these collaborative robots or consumer-based robots that will be out into the world in our workplaces and homes at scale, then typically those particular robots will be designed by large industry actors. And the behavior decisions, the policy-related decisions that I mentioned before, those kind of decisions will come directly from the private sector in that sense. And that can actually be quite dangerous, especially if the design decisions are motivated by private sector's interests. And even worse, if those specific design decisions are made blindly. So if we are thinking about massive influence on human behaviors at scale, and we don't necessarily have a clear guidance on what kind of future society we should be looking for, or what kind of behaviors we would like to have influence, then we are driving blind, so to speak. Just because I've been looking at human-robot collaboration in particular, I can also mention the impact on labor rights as well, which is that in Canada, we have a labor code that gives Canadian workers 3 basic rights. We have the right to know, especially when it comes to information about workplace hazards. We have the right to participate in identifying and correcting work-related health and safety concerns. And we have the right to refuse work when we feel that the workplace is not safe. And when we think about, for example, the influence of entrainment type scenarios, then it becomes quite tricky for the user or the human collaborator of a human-robot collaboration scenario to think about the actual harm, or even be able to detect whether you are actually being influenced by a robot being, creepily speeding up its motions and thereby affecting my motion and so forth. So if you don't necessarily have a clear idea of what the harm may be in those cases, then there is less capacity for us as workers to identify and correct for that work-related health and safety concerns, nor have the idea of even refusing to work in a human-robot collaboration scenarios. And I think many of us will agree that we need more robots into the front lines to help us go through the economic crisis of the future. But if we have these uncertainties hanging, that's not necessarily going to be helpful. So at the same time, we also need to understand the fact that some of these behavioral changes that I'm mentioning may be it may sound very minute, but at the same time, if you think about the fact that human-human behavioral changes actually have a chain effect, and they become norms, behavioral norms or social norms that get ingrained into the society, then I think we can think about the bigger picture of what the issues may be. What kind of social norms do we want to design with respect to our relationship with robots, and how robots actually influence our behaviors and decisions? At the end of the day, I think it all comes down to the big question of what kind of society do we want to build for the future. And I think you'll agree with me that this is a really hard question to address because not everyone will agree. But having some idea of it, or at least trying to come to an informed consensus, I think can be useful, because otherwise I think the danger here is that we will be creating social systems that are designed quite blindly. So what do we do about that, apart from having more discussions about the future we want to design? I think there is definitely a lot more research we can do, especially when it comes to thinking about how we measure and understand what is quality HRI. So what does it mean to have a quality HRI? When you think about the effects, even the unintended consequences of small design changes in the interactive behaviors we design into the systems. And I think there's something to be said about thinking about designing for diversity, or even creating consumer-based products that are much more customizable and programmable by the consumers, because that would mean that us as consumers or the users will be able to control the kind of behaviors the robot will exhibit in our homes. And obviously, through more of the research, I think a lot of our understanding to be had should be translated quickly into the policy and standard shaping, so that as we roll out more of these interactive robotic systems, we are better informed and we can actually prevent possible harms in the future. So this has been much more of a raising of questions. I haven't actually told you anything new in particular, but to frame our research in human-robot interaction from a particular lens and adding some ethics-related questions on top. These came as a result of my discussions with my students, in particular with my PhD student Shalali Rizmani and Sarah Brooks, and a number of my new students at the RAISE Lab. We're also hiring, so please do apply. Or spread the word anyways. So I would like to open this up as a broader discussion point for us to think about the influential machines that we are designing. And thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk and the practical tips in the end. So a reminder that anybody can ask their questions in the chat. You can either say you have a question and we'll pass the mic to you, or you can write the question explicitly and we'll read it out loud. So from Iran, do you have a question?
Hello, this is Iran. I'm really happy to have you here, and I think Martin explained this before, but I just wanted to reiterate that. Thanks for a very great talk. So I was wondering, you know, the problem with the unpredictable experiment. So the kind of influence and the kind of the kind of effects of our experiment on the users we see in the lab is really different. I think, at least I assume it's very different from the one when it deploys in the wild. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how as a researcher as roboticists, you know, apart from extending our imagination, how we can basically have a role in unintended effects that our discovery may have in the end result deployment by the industry or or any other stakeholder. Have you ever thought about this?
Yeah, so I think there's two different things there. One element of it is really the notion of the controlled experiments and translation of that into the real world. And to address that point, I do think that's the case. I think in general, in HRI, we have a lot more controlled experiments than more of ethnographic studies where we can be flies on the wall and actually watch people interact with robots and how the kind of novelty effect of a cool robot at home actually wears off. In general, I think we do need more understanding of that to be able to inform what are some of these novel influences that do wear off over time, and what are the ones that actually persist. And I think the question here is, of those that actually do persist, what are the ones that would be harmful, to be able to address the question of, okay, how do we inform the policy making or standard shaping so that we can be proactive in preventing those particular types of influences from being exerted or abused, so to speak. Yeah.